Hey, what's going on, guys? My name's Griffin, and I'm a filmmaker based out of Orange County, California. And today we're going to talk about the Canon R3 versus the Canon C70. So in this video, I want to cover four main things. First one is going to be image quality. Second one is going to be slow motion. Third one is going to be overexposure recovery. Fourth one is going to be autofocus. And then I'm going to close it out with some of my thoughts on who I think these cameras are really designed for. A couple quick notes about these tests. For all the tests, the Canon C70 was using the speed booster, and the R3 was using the EF to RF adapter. And I was using very similar lenses on both cameras. So it won't be an identical match because the C70 is using the speed booster, but that is how I like to use it in the real world. I use EF glass, and I want it to have that sort of full frame look. So just keep that in mind with all these tests. With that in mind, the first thing I noticed when I look at these images was how much the speed booster affected the C70 in terms of the sun glare. I really noticed it kind of washed out a lot of the image there. And while I don't hate the look, it's definitely interesting to note. Now for me personally, I use the C70 all the time, and currently it's probably the camera I use the most out of all of them. But it is interesting to see when you put a standard camera with no speed booster and no extra glass in front of the sensor, side by side with one that does have the extra piece of glass with the speed booster. It was kind of crazy to see how much it affected the image with all those extra glares there. In terms of dynamic range, honestly, I couldn't say one has more than the other. You know, I don't necessarily think this particular scene is the best showcase of dynamic range. Obviously, if I could be filming someone, say, inside and have some clouds outside and try to expose for both of them, that'd be a little bit better test. So this particular one wasn't the greatest test of dynamic range, but just from using the cameras in the real world, I would say they're pretty similar. In terms of sharpness, I would say the clear winner for this one is the R3. The R3 has a really sharp and detailed image. Now, I say that, I don't always like that. For me personally, I prefer a little bit of a softer image. Actually, for this particular thing I'm filming right now, I'm using a 1/4 Pro Mist because I like the way it softens the skin a little bit. So you may or may not want sharpness, but the R3 has a really sharp and detailed image. And the C70 it's not bad at all, in my opinion. I think it's pretty par for the course, you could say, but it doesn't have that sort of like overly detailed, sharpened image. It's got, I'd say a little more of a cinematic look to it, a little more film-like, if you will. Last thing on the topic of image quality I noticed was the color depth of the R3. So for all these tests, they were shot in RAW, and it's 12-bit. And on the C70, I shot everything in the XFAVC 10-bit, and you can really notice the color difference if you put the images side by side. There's just a little bit more natural saturation to the R3 image. Now, granted, shooting RAW comes with like a whole bunch of problems and like file size, for example. But, you know, if we're talking about image quality, I would say the R3 has got a little bit more saturation and overall life to the image than the C70 does. And that was something that came as a huge surprise to me. In terms of slow motion, I didn't film a specific 4K 60 test because everything that's true in 24 frames on both of these cameras is true in 60 frames as well. So you get all the same frame rates, get all the same codecs, you get all the same autofocus settings, whereas with like the 1DX Mark III, you lose out on autofocus. So I didn't see a real point to shooting a 4K 60 test, but when it comes to 4K 120, both of these cameras can shoot 4K 120, which is pretty cool. This is where there's a pretty big difference in both of these cameras. The Canon R3 can shoot pretty nice 4K 120. Now there is one downside. All these tests were shot in RAW. You have to jump back over to the MP4 files for this, which the downside to that is you can only get C-Log 3. You can't get C-Log 2, which is what's going to get you the flattest picture profile and the most dynamic range. So it's still a really nice image, still looks really good. The downside though is if you're shooting, say, a project and you're handed over to a colorist, you're shooting everything in C-Log 2, all your cameras are matching, and then you want to shoot some 120 frames, it's going to be in C-Log 3. So it just kind of, for me, it creates a little bit of a headache because you're going to have to go and make notes for your editor. Hey, you know, just those files that were in 120, just make sure to color those different because it's a different flavor of C-Log. It's not the same. So that's a little bit of an annoyance for me. With the C70, there's no real penalties for shooting 4K 120. You can shoot 4K 120 in C-Log 2, just like you can shoot your 4K 60, just like you can shoot your 4K 24. And you do have to shoot in the long GOP codec for 4K 60 and 4K 120. But for me, I haven't been able to notice a real difference in image quality. I do notice a difference in editing. It's much more difficult to edit. But to be honest with the C70, I'm always using proxies anyway, so I don't find it as a real hiccup in my own personal workflow. Now, one huge downside with shooting 4K 120 on the Canon R3 is overheating. And when the R5 came out, that was like what everybody was talking about, overheating, overheating, overheating. I even made a video on using the R5 in the real world and my overheating experience. Well, guess what? The R3 does overheat. So, and if you're shooting 4K 120, I don't know exactly the amount of time it is, but I think it's around 12 minutes. And I actually gave the R3 on one of the first days I had it to my friend Mike, and he was shooting with it, and he was like, dude, the camera's overheating, it's overheating. And it was only after like a really short amount of time. So it's just super interesting to know it does overheat. So if you're planning on using that in a professional setting, say you're filming a boxing fight, and you want to shoot 4K 120 for the whole fight, it's not going to be a great pick for that, because you're really going to have to be conscious of knowing, okay, is this camera going to overheat soon? One positive note about the R3's overheating is it does recover a lot quicker than the R5 did. So I don't know exactly recovery times and all that stuff. That's not what this particular video is about, but just keep that in mind if you are planning on using the 4K 120 modes. In terms of overexposure recovery, I think this is probably where I was most surprised with the cameras. I was so prepared to just be like, oh, the C70 is better image quality, because with the 1DX Mark III, when I did tests on my channel about that particular camera, there was much more dynamic range in the C70. Well, I think all that's different. At least from my testing, my initial thoughts, these cameras look basically the same in terms of overexposure recovery. And if I had to give a nod to one, I might give it to the R3. So the way that I was recovering these clips in RAW is I just went into the RAW settings on Premiere, dropped it by 3 stops, and these clips were like mega overexposed. No one would ever expose this way in the real world. But when I dropped it down 3 stops, the image pretty much looks perfect. It's pretty much ready to go. Now with the C70, what I did is I just dropped the highlights, dropped the shadows, and the image still looks really good. But I do notice the color and the vibrance of the image on the R3 just looks a little bit more pleasing to me than the way the C70 does. On the topic of autofocus, I was so ready to come in here and say, oh, the R3's got so much better autofocus. And in some ways, it definitely does. I would say my favorite modes are the animal eye auto tracking. It's similar to how it is on the R5. So here's my dog Luna, and the way the camera grabs on to her, and I can basically just, I don't have to touch the screen, I don't have to do anything. The camera intelligently tracks her, and it can track the back of her head, her body, and when she's facing the camera, it'll track her eye. So that's just such a cool setting, so useful. If you film any type of animals, it's going to be a really useful setting for you. Another cool mode on the R3 for autofocus is the vehicle tracking. I actually took the C70 and the R3 over to my friend Brendan's shop, and I used both of the cameras in the real world on an actual paid job, and I got to use some of the vehicle tracking modes. And I do have a full BTS of that particular shoot coming later this week. So if you're interested in more C70 versus R3 camera comparisons in the real world, feel free to subscribe, and that should be coming later this week. But the vehicle tracking mode is really cool because you can basically intelligently track the vehicle, and I could see that being really handy for any people that might do any vehicle-to-vehicle filming or anything like that. Now, one downside with the R3's autofocus is I did find it to be a bit jumpy, whereas with the C70, I find that if it grabs onto someone's face, it's going to have the face. It's usually, in most circumstances, not going to jump to the background. With the R3, I found it did a really nice job grabbing onto a subject's face, even if they were smaller in the frame. But you can see Delaney walking towards the camera here, and it jumps to the background there, which I didn't find that as a particularly challenging circumstance for the autofocus, so that came as a bit of a surprise to me. I did find it to be a little bit less reliable than I would like. Now, personally, I might be a little bit nervous to use it in a professional setting, just without knowing the limitations of the autofocus. Now, one thing to note here, every camera that has autofocus has challenges. Cameras from different brands, Canon, all of them. So just the important thing is to learn where your camera does well and where it's not going to do well with autofocus. And it's up to you as the operator to make sure you can understand the circumstances and make the best decision whether or not it's good to use autofocus there. With the C70, I would say I do trust it more. My favorite setting on the C70 is the face-only autofocus mode. Now what that does is it will only grab onto a face if there's a face in the frame. And if you leave the frame, like you bend over, you come back, it's not going to jump to the background. Now with the R3, you can see here's Delaney, and the moment that she leaves the frame, it jumps to the background, which for me is a super unprofessional look. Now I really wish that they'd take this face only autofocus mode and put it into the R3. That would make it super powerful. Another cool thing with the C70's autofocus is I do find that the whole area autofocus just generally does a good job focusing on what I want it to. And I got these settings from my friend Matt from the Film Poets, but if you turn the face only off and you put it just on whole area, so it basically won't even track a face, it does a super good job. And I find this setting to be really nice for, especially for gimbal work. If I just wanted to basically focus on whatever the main subject is in front of the camera, it does a great job there. Overall, if I had to give a nod for autofocus to either the C70 or the R3, I might have a tough time, but if I had to only pick one, I think I might actually pick the C70's autofocus, as crazy as that sounds. And I think the biggest reason for that is I have a really good familiarity with it, mainly just because I've used it so much. Whereas with the R3, I think it can be really good. I just haven't quite used it enough to know all the quirks and when it's going to work and when it's not going to work. But I am excited to do some more autofocus testing with the R3. So if you watched the video up to this point, you might be thinking, wow, okay, the R3, it's priced basically the same as the C70 with the speed booster, and it pretty much did better for the majority of the tests. Now, I would caution you, if you're only a video shooter, to go ahead and jump ship to the R3. There's quite a few penalties that come with using a camera like the R3. Like, one of the biggest ones is you don't get built-in waveform. And the second biggest one, in my opinion, is the codecs that you have to use. All the tests that I shot today were using RAW, which is the highest quality. So the file sizes, I'll put it up on screen, but there's a massive difference for the file sizes. The C70 is just so much more of a usable camera in the real world, in my particular experience. And maybe the R3 is great for you, but if I had to pick one and I was just a professional DP or a camera operator or videographer or whatever, 10 out of 10 times I pick the C70 for video work. Now, I did buy the R3 with my own money. I love it. It's been such a great camera so far. And the reason I like the R3 is I love it for the photo capabilities. I love it for the fact that for the type of video work that I do with it, which is generally like travel stuff. If I want a weather sealed body, like I'm in the snow or I'm in the rain or whatever, knowing that I have a camera that's small, it's lightweight, but it's also super powerful. That for me is really valuable. And that's why I bought the R3, because I do find it to be a really strong performer for the type of use case that I like. So if you're maybe like a social media content creator and you want to shoot a lot of photos and videos, and you're someone that could benefit from a hybrid camera that could do both in one package, this could be a really great camera for you. I think at the time of making this video, the Canon R3 is probably the best hybrid mirrorless camera out there. What you get in terms of video performance and photo performance in the same package, all in a really strong weather sealed body that has great battery life, is pretty much second to none. Now, I would be interested in doing a comparison against some of the offerings from Sony, like the A1, for example. And so maybe I'll have to hit up some of my friends that might have that camera and see if they want to do something on the channel. But, I do love the R3, and I'm definitely going to do some more comparisons coming to the channel soon. So anyways, guys, like I mentioned, these are really two different cameras built for two different purposes. But I'd like to hear from you. Which camera do you think fits your needs best? Do you think the C70 with its more video-centric features would work better? Or do you think maybe having the hybrid mirrorless capabilities of an R3 would work better for you? Hopefully you got some value out of this video today, and hopefully you enjoyed it as well. If you like this kind of content, consider hitting that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.